Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another ETPotion webinar. Today, we are talking about permitting. Permitting is a hot topic, especially in the EU now, because the European Commission has released a new Repower EU communication that really aims at accelerating permitting of renewables, or the deployment of new renewables, also by accelerating or facilitating permitting processes. And of course, for ocean energy, it is important because it's the way to get our devices in the water, and it might delay the whole project if the permitting is not going so smoothly. So the aim of this webinar is to look at two countries and the permitting processes in those, so the UK and France, and give you a bit of an overview and tips on how to navigate through permitting in those countries. So today we have speakers from the Tiger project. Tiger is an Interreg project, and James will talk about it a little bit more in just a second. Just sharing my screen quickly. Voila. So our speakers today are James Murray, a program manager from Orbital Marine Power, and Marlene Kiesnowski, a manager of Cineo. And sorry, I should introduce myself. I am Lotte Virtima, Senior Policy Officer at Ocean Energy Europe. And with that, I think we can go straight to the first presentation. Just if you have questions, and I hope you do, please submit them through the Q&A box. We will take them after the two presentations today. And it will be good also to hear if you have own experiences, or if you've encountered any challenges or anything, please share that in the Q&A, and we will read them out loud. It would be nice to have a bit of a discussion going on this topic as well. And yeah, with that, I hand it over to you, James.
Thanks very much, Lotte. So yeah, my name is James Murray. I'm program manager at Orbital Marine Power, also project manager for the Tiger project. So yeah, firstly, I'd like to just highlight some of the key achievements and objectives for the Tiger project. It was a 48 million euro project. It's really focused on driving down cost reduction associated with tidal stream energy, making the sector more mature, more bankable, and some practical work around consenting and de-risking a range of tidal stream sites in the Rab Blanchard and in the English Channel on both the French side and on the UK side. So really kind of stimulating the sector quite broadly, but then with that specific focus on the Channel region. So one of the initiatives myself and Marlene led on in the Tiger project was really the streamlining and the approach to consenting within the region. And today I'm going to focus on the UK, and not just on the actual Channel region, but on Scotland and Wales as well, because a lot of the activity in recent years in terms of tidal stream project development has been in Scotland and Wales also. So I'm just going to kick off firstly with the planning, the regulatory context for what we're doing with regard consenting. So helpfully, kind of dropping out of the Maritime Spatial Planning Directive, we've now got a range of marine spatial plans covering the seawaters around the UK. Now, the areas we're focused on and we're probably most interested in are the kind of south of England around the Isle of Wight, South Wales and North Wales, the west of Scotland and the north of Scotland right up until Shetland. That's where, between those regions where the vast majority of the tidal resource is, and where we're going to be developing commercial sites. And the policymakers that have developed these marine spatial plans have helpfully, where there is tidal stream resource, have recognized that and put in specific provisions and guidance and planning policies to guide developers. So in particular, the the pilot Pentland Firth and Orkney Waters Marine Spatial Plan has good guidance for developers. And when the Welsh National Marine Plan was adopted quite recently, they also developed specific locational guidance for tidal stream energy as part of that. And it's very helpful as part of your feasibility processes to understand that there is a marine spatial planning framework in place to help guide you and to look at constraints, other sea users, and where there's already identified zones of kind of that are preferred for tidal stream energy development. Obviously, planning is a huge area, and there's a range of policies, but within the UK, I think it's helpful for you to know that tends to be national planning policies at individual country level. So Scotland has its own planning policies, Wales has its own planning policies, and England as well. Within the UK, then there tends to be a range of local development plans at a kind of a county level or at a city level. And that has most relevance for kind of the onshore works, the onshore planning, substations, things like that. And then, as I'm sure a number of you are familiar with, as there is across the EU, there is a range of Natura 2000 sites, so special protection areas for birds, special areas of conservation as well, and all of those need to be considered as well with respect to planning policy. So that's the key planning context. And within the UK, we're very fortunate. A range of tidal stream sites have been developed, and these are a list of ones that have been successfully through the planning process. There's a small number of others that didn't quite make it through for various reasons. And the projects that have been consented from around 2010 onwards, right up until the last kind of year or so, have been for a range of sizes from 500 kilowatts up to 240 megawatts for the Moorlice project in Wales. So there's been a lot of learning for both developers and regulators that's come out of that in terms of environmental impact assessment methodologies, in terms of stimulating a regulatory process and legislation around consenting projects, and really how to deal with the fact that there is some environmental uncertainties around certain impacts because of the emerging nature of the sector. So there's a lot of learning can be taken from that, and I'm going to go into a bit more detail in a couple of minutes on that. But firstly, just to put the consenting in context with respect to the legislation and regulatory environment, there's essentially two consenting routes for tidal stream projects in the UK for the kind of that suits the vast majority of projects. There's what's called the Section 36 consent route, and essentially that's kind of it varies slightly in England, Scotland, and Wales as to when to go down that route. It depends on the installed capacity of your project, but from anything from a megawatt up to 100 megawatts in England, up to 350 megawatts in Wales, and for all sizes in Scotland, that is the correct route to go down. Route 2 is called a development consent order, and that's for larger projects that have kind of national significance, and it's a slightly more streamlined process, but it's not really till projects start becoming a lot larger that we'll see that process being used more. So I'm going to focus today on the Section 36 consent process, which is the process the vast majority of tidal stream projects are likely to use over the next few years. The other thing I'd say is in parallel with the Section 36 consent process, there's also a requirement to secure a marine license. But the supporting document for both the Section 36 consent and the marine license are essentially the same, kind of an environmental impact assessment. And that documentation can also be used to support what's called an appropriate assessment, which is if your project has Natura 2000 considerations, so it could potentially impact on one of those special areas of conservation or protection. So as part of the Section 36 consenting route, there's a standard process, scoping, where you kind of a formal process where you consult with the main licensing authority and their advisors on what your environmental impact assessment needs to cover, what surveys you need to do, and how you're going to, what methodologies you should apply. So that's typically a kind of a 3-4 month process. Then you need to prepare your environmental impact assessment, and obviously all the baseline surveys that feed into that as well. And then something to be aware of in the UK, it varies a little bit depending on what country, but there is typically a formal requirement to do public consultation, and it's called pre-application consultation. That's typically done in parallel with the environmental impact assessment and towards the latter stages of the assessment, but it's just something to be aware of, that there is a formal requirement to do that consultation to a kind of a minimal level of standard. And it's something that you can quite easily forget about and can kind of delay you. So it's important to be aware of that. So once you've done that and you've carried out your environmental impact assessment, produced your environmental statement, the licensing body will go through a gate check process to make sure that it kind of meets all the requirements and all the requirements as set out by the scoping responses. Then the application is submitted to the licensing authority. And, some authorities set like target dates of 9 months to assess the simplest of applications, but inevitably these projects are never that straightforward, and there's often requirements for additional information. There's often requirements for some additional assessments in key areas, so it never really goes as smoothly as that, or as quickly as that. So there's, as I say, 9 months might be the minimum period that a very, very small, straightforward application could be assessed within the EIA framework, and the Section 36 framework. It's usually going to be more than that. Then the licensing authority will draft a recommendation, and that will go for final sign-off, typically to the government. Once the marine license and the Section 36 consent are issued, then there will be a long process of discharging all the planning conditions associated with those 2 licenses in ahead of commissioning the project. Within Scotland, the licensing authority for the first point of contact for all of this is Marine Scotland on behalf of the Scottish Government. In Wales, it is Natural Resources Wales and Welsh ministers for Section 36 consent. And in England, it's the Marine Management Organisation. And in this table below, essentially, these are all the key advisors. They'll rely very, very heavily on the natural heritage bodies like Nature Scot, Natural England, and Natural Resources Wales as well, to provide that specialist guidance. So yeah, the biggest and the most expensive and the intensive part of this whole process will be the environmental impact assessment. And based on lessons learned from the projects I cited that have went through the process in the UK, based on guidance, these are the types of impacts that will need to be assessed. So on the left, we've got all the offshore environment. On the right, we've got the onshore environment. There'll obviously be some overlap between them as well. So that scoping process I mentioned will be the first step in understanding how to go about assessing all of these impacts. Some of them will be desk-based studies, and some of them will require a significant amount of site environmental data, bird data, marine mammal data to be collected, for instance. Now, in the UK, there's typically the potential to apply for a single consent application to cover all the onshore works and the offshore works through the Section 36 process. You don't have to do that, and it's important that you communicate with regulators, with the licensing authority, as to what route you want to go down, but that can have advantages for streamlining the process if you can apply for a single consent for the onshore and the offshore works. So yeah, just coming back to how this has worked in practice and a couple of the key projects, some of the larger projects. The first one, the Maygen project, and this came out of the first significant leasing round for tidal stream projects in the UK by the Crown Estate. Maygen progressed to consent for, that's a Simic Atlantis essentially, for an 86 megawatt project with 61 turbines around 2012, 2013, and was the largest consented project at this time. It was a full environmental impact assessment, but one of the key issues really, recognizing it was the first large consented site, was there was a lack of understanding at the time on collision risk impacts. And one of the key sensitive species in that area was harbour seal. So the developer, in conjunction with Scottish Natural Heritage at the time, Nature Scot, and with Marine Scotland, developed a survey, deploy and monitoring policy. And essentially this is an adaptive management approach whereby the initial phase of the project, I think, was limited to 6 turbines until more environmental monitoring data could be gathered, until understanding around potential collision risk could be improved, allowing for subsequent permitting of larger phases for the project. Similarly, and more recently with the Morelice project in 2021, similar approaches were taken, but one of the complications here is that Morelice is being developed by a kind of a not-for-profit organization which is focused on economic development within the North Wales region. It's technology agnostic, so it just really wants the best projects, the best technologies to deploy on the site. And it's tried to develop a consent that is very, very flexible in terms of technology types, numbers and sizes, and really future-proof that consent. So what we call in the UK a Rochdale envelope, but essentially a kind of a worst-case envelope was applied to all those ranges of technology types and numbers to develop a kind of reasonable worst-case impact assessment for the project. It's an environmentally sensitive area. Key species are bottlenose dolphin, a range of diving birds as well. So certainly, there was a lot of significant work and stakeholder engagement work went into developing an appropriate approach. And I mean, ultimately, there will be the deployment at the site will depend on what technologies succeed, secure finance, and the scenarios for deployment will vary from what was in what was exactly in the original application. So there's a number of device deployment plans in place just to kind of monitor who's going to be coming forward on the site, who's going to deploy, what the impact is going to look like for key species, and what emerging data is coming from around the sector to inform those impact assessments and refine them, and hopefully de-risk some of those potential impacts as well. So that's essentially an adaptive management approach. It's a phased approach to permitting additional phases of the project as more environmental data becomes available, not just from the site, but from throughout the sector. So, hopefully you've gathered that there's a pretty good mature process in place for permitting in the UK, but there are challenges, specifically with regard to tidal stream energy. But they're the same challenges that any emerging technology would face. While some of the assessments, the methodologies are pretty straightforward, and they're analogous with other sectors. I guess collision risk is something where we need more environmental monitoring data to allow regulators to be less precautionary and validate those models around collision risk. One of the other challenges we have is, and it's a challenge for, cash-strapped technology developers, excuse me, is developing a cost-effective survey strategy, particularly for birds and marine mammals. And a lot of that's led by the cost of vessels, the size of vessels, and what the local vessel market is. With the right advice and a good understanding of the vessel market, it is possible to agree cost-effective survey strategies with stakeholders. But there's no getting around it that offshore development it doesn't come cheap. The third thing really to say is the survey and environmental impact assessment is probably going to be minimum 1.5 to 2.5 years of survey in EIA. And again, that's typically driven by the length of the bird surveys and marine mammal surveys. 2 years would be very typical for a medium to large project. Maybe 1 year might be agreeable with the regulators for a smaller project within the EIA framework. For much smaller projects, I will just kind of caveat that it's worth having a discussion with the regulators on what's required, but I'm talking here about kind of commercial scale projects. And then also to consider, it's going to become a very, very active time in the UK and in the wider North Sea region with regard to consenting. And that's not going to help with aspirational timescales around consenting, but hopefully regulators, governments will recognize that to achieve those very challenging deployment targets around offshore renewables. In general, it's important that regulators and stakeholder bodies are well equipped and well resourced to support us in that as well. And yeah, just to say there are aspirational targets around consenting, but ultimately there's potential for statutory objections, and complex sites may require further environmental information before those sites and those projects can be determined. And then just a couple of final things. So assuming you've got your Section 36 consent and your marine license, there will be a range of planning conditions that need discharged. And as I say, there's quite a lot of them, but some of the key ones to note: there will be some additional license requirements, protected species licenses. That's usually around marine mammals and basking sharks. There may be a requirement to secure a license for new marking or new lighting. If that's something you set out in your environmental assessment would be required as mitigation, then you'll need to secure the licenses for them before you can commission the project. Similarly, you may require a safety zone, that is an exclusion zone for maybe the installation, operation, or decommissioning of the project. So you need to consider, again, if you had set out in your environmental assessment that that's required, then you'll need to apply for a license for that. And then there's also a much wider process around agreeing a decommissioning program for that project. And that can be quite involved. So I'm just going to, and I can hold things up a little bit, so I'm going to provide a bit more detail on that as well. So yeah, as I say, there are lots of planning conditions you'll need to look at, but one of the ones that I just like to highlight is decommissioning, because it can be the longest to agree and to discharge. So essentially there are legislation in place around agreeing a decommissioning program with the licensing authority, and there'll be a consultation required with a range of offshore stakeholders associated with that. So that in itself will take a number of months at least to progress. But one of the other things that can hold things up is there will be a requirement to agree financial securities in place associated with decommissioning before the project starts. You need to have an agreement as part of that decommissioning program as to what the amount of financial securities are, and what form you'll need to put them in place. And obviously you'll need to go then and raise finance associated with them. So that's going to, yeah, in our experience, that can take time. It's not a straightforward process sometimes. So yeah, you need to ensure that when you're doing your detailed project planning, that that once you've received your main licenses, it's still going to take time before you've got all the planning conditions, particularly decommissioning, approved before you're going to be able to commission the project. And then very finally, just some other considerations and requirements that I didn't have time to go into today, but our guidance document has more detail on. There's a whole leasing process around securing seabed leases for tidal stream projects in the UK. While I've discussed the licenses to install and operate your technology, there may be licenses you need just to carry out the environmental surveys and resource assessment surveys. So again, there's some licensing procedures around that, but you may be able to get exemptions. So again, there's a whole ream of legislation around that needs to be considered. Typically, developers look to secure grid connection agreements in parallel with consenting. So again, that needs to be considered as part of your site development strategy. So you don't, you're not delayed, or you have a consent, but you don't have a grid connection agreement. And finally, there's sometimes a requirement for an electricity generation license as well, or to at least seek exemptions around that. So this is separate to the planning process. There's legislation around when you also need to require a license to generate electricity. It's not a long process to secure that, but it's just something to be aware of that may be relevant to your project as well. So yeah, with everything I've discussed today is available in much more detail on the Tiger website under the resources section. The report's called Guidelines for Development of Tidal Energy Projects for England, Scotland and Wales. I'd just advise, if you've got any like to get more detail, have a look at that document first, and if you've got any further then questions, happy for you to get in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. That was really interesting and comprehensive. I have a couple of questions already myself, but I will keep those for later. So I suggest we just move on to the next presentation and then have a Q&A after. So I would like to give the floor to Madeleine and talk about the process in France.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me well? And can you see my screen?
Yes,
perfect.
perfect.
Thanks, Lotta. My name is Marlene Kirsnowski. I'm the site manager at Seneo, which is a small-scale test site for tidal turbine. And we also have activity around the Paimpol-Bréhat tidal site in Brittany, in northern France. So just in mirror of what James explained in the UK, I'll try to give you an overview of the consenting process in France, knowing that this is definitely not an official guidance, but rather our experience and understanding of the process in France. The report has been written closely with Sabella, more precisely with Morbihan Hydroénergie, which is a target partner, and their help was very precious, as they have a lot of experience in France in terms of permitting. So maybe just an overview of the consenting project to date in France. So what is worth to be noted is that we have the two largest projects that has been consenting are located in the Raz Blanchard. They were actually consented to French utility EDF and ENGIE a couple of years ago, and this consent has recently changed to 2 different consortium now, and the projects are under development. Then we've got 2 tidal test sites that I mentioned just before in my introduction, Paimpol-Bréhat and Bordeaux, more in the south. You cannot see it in the map. and another couple of projects that have been developed by Sabela with different power projects ranging from 500 kilowatts to 1 megawatt. So all this project has been consented, and to date we don't have in France largest consent, just as Morlaix on Maygen that were discussed by James earlier on. I'd like to introduce you to 2 different routes that we have identified. The first one, I call it greenfield, but it's only my vocabulary to discuss a route that has been used so far, which is probably used for small-scale projects. But we anticipate and we expect that we would have a tender route later on in the future with a process of consenting that will be closer to the one of offshore wind. So in the first one, which is the one that has been used so far, it is the operator itself who develops the area and is in charge of the entire process. So it's a bit like other renewable energy projects onshore. So we would recommend first to have a look at the planning context, and I'll go back to that a bit later. But of course, the maritime space has a number of pre-existing activity and natural area you should take into consideration while you're developing your project. Once the project is defined, you run an EIA, just as I suppose everywhere in Europe. And this environmental impact assessment will allow you to apply for at least 2 kinds of authorization. I will also discuss those more into details later on. An environmental one and a seabed lease. Once you get that authorization, you can apply for grid connection. And in that regard, you will be in relation with the probably distribution network in France, the DSO, which is Enedis, at least for relatively small scale projects. In terms of public participation, there is an optional consultation that you can run before you apply for the authorization. And there is a mandatory public inquiry that will be requested to give you the final authorizations. And just as in the UK, the environmental impact assessment and the public inquiry can be merged into one for the different authorization. It's not detailed in this figure. However, for the grid connection, you'll need also an EIA and a seabed lease that can be merged or not for the onshore part. And another things to have in mind is that in this process, you do not get automatically a feed-in tariff nor a contract for difference. That will be based on a negotiation with the French regulator, Commission de Régulation de l'Énergie. And there is a legal framework to request an FIT. However, it's quite a long process, and I would say not straightforward. This is a bit what will change or what we anticipate in the future. In France, we've not yet go to the commercial tender for tidal. However, we anticipate tenders to be launched in the near future. And in that new era, let's say, we anticipate a consenting process much closer to that of offshore wind. which is also relatively recent. So how does it work? So in that case, the state controls the entire process. He will lead on public debates earlier on a specific area that is pre-selected. It is not the operator that select the area. The state would also run the baseline studies that would be given to the operator afterwards, so that he can apply for the authorization. In between, there is the tendering process in the form of a competitive dialogue where candidates are pre-selected firstly, and once they have proven a number of technical and financial capacity, they are allowed to compete for the tender itself. Once the consortium is awarded the tender, it gets automatically, let's say, the seabed lease and has to realize the impact assessment to get the environmental authorization. The public inquiry here is also mandatory. Another specificity in this process, which is now applied to quite a few offshore wind projects since a few years, is that the grid connection is not anymore endorsed by the DSO, but the TSO, the transmission system operator, which is RTE in France. We expect these projects to be over 17 megawatts. And what is a bit new for us in France is that the TSO will also pay for the grid connection. In the previous route, the costs are borne by the operator, and this would not be the case anymore for this consenting route. But essentially, between these two processes, the same permits are required in the end. So the environmental authorization, the seabed lease, and of course a number of permits onshore. But I will not elaborate on those too much during that presentation. I will leave it to the report you can also consult online. Just a few words on the planning context. So a bit like in the UK, we've got a number of plans, maritime spatial plan. We've got also energy plan, and we've got also many protected areas that are subjected to specific plan, and that will help to scope the EIA for the project. The multi-annual energy plan is actually living document that is discussed every 3 or 6 years, where the state define the energy policy of the country as a whole, and this includes the commercial tenders for renewable energy technologies. So far, tidal was not included, but we expect, and that's the wish of the industry, to get now a commercial tender in the future. And I have included in that slide the wish of the industry, and we've got a good. We hope to get those tender delivered in the near future. We also have regional plans for grid connection that are to be taken into consideration. But of course, if the TSO is responsible for the entire connection, you're not concerned directly. There are also maritime spatial documents that we call strategic facade document. Facade meaning coastline. France is divided into 4 facades. And for tidal energy project, of course, there is only 2 areas that are of particular interest. So Manche Est, Mer du Nord, and Atlantic Nord, Manche Ouest. So essentially two documents that need to be addressed. Those are also living documents, and they are being reviewed at the moment. And of course, protected areas, as I mentioned before, we've got national classification. We've got also European classification through Natura 200 with the same type of constraints that in the UK. Well, now in terms of permits, we'll address different topics. The first one is that there is a threshold for authorization for a small-scale project at sea with an amount of below 2 million euro, exactly 1,900 million euro. There is no need for an authorization, but you can go for a simple declaration. Normally, it does not apply for tidal energy unless you've developing a small scale project, of course, but it's maybe worse to know. Regarding the EIA, there is also a different way to see the EIA. It is not always mandatory to, sorry, give me 1 second. Excusez-moi, mais c'est pas possible. Sorry, a bit noisy around me. So it is not always mandatory to go through the EIA, and you can request for tidal energy project. You can request the administration to evaluate whether or not this EIA is mandatory or not. However, we've got experience where the administration explained that probably you won't need to go through the full EIA, and eventually they decided the contrary. So we would advise to be conscious about time, because you can lose a lot of time if you try the case-by-case study. So keep that in mind. Normally, for large-scale projects, the EIA would be mandatory. About the environmental authorization, there has been a number of modification this past few years, with a lot of simplification into the French law. Before, there were many different authorizations that have been merged into one. So we call that unique environmental authorization, which is the process and obviously shorten the delay to obtain it. Another significant evolution was the envelope permit, which is very new for us, based on the Rockdale envelope that James has mentioned earlier. So the environmental authorization can be based on a worst case scenario where you will be able to manage uncertainties if you don't know exactly the number of devices or their how much megawatt you will produce per device, the exact type of foundation. So there is some flexibility around that. It has to be noted that while this envelope has been applied for offshore wind, it has not yet been applied for tidal. So we will see how it goes. The administration responsible for evaluating the environmental authorization is the DDTM in France, meaning the regional department of the states for the sea. We've got a DDTM in every French department, so it is the department where you develop the project, of course, that should evaluate your application. The prefect is the head of the DDTM and will be the one that issue the prefect order. I have mentioned there the delays because with the simplification of the process, the administration commits to delay, but commits is still a bit theoretical, because of course it can take a lot more time depending on the burden of the administration and a number of different parameters. The concession for the use of the public maritime domain is another authorization that you will need to apply for. It's the authorization to use the sea, or the portion of the sea that you would need for the project. Once you request that, there will be a publicity released in the official newspaper. Normally, the duration for such a concession is 30 years, but there is a derogation for offshore projects to 40 years. In this document, you will have to make sure the responsibility and insurance are set up. You've got also here the financial fee for dismantling, and the financial terms of the lease, because you will have to pay for a lease on an annual basis. Here again, you will the EIA will be used as the dossier for this permit. Again, the DDTM will be the one evaluating the application. And also mandatory consultations will occur. This time it will not be towards the environmental authority, but it will be towards the military and sea users, so fishing communities, etc. Again, the prefect issued the concession, signed the concession, and a public inquiry is required. As James, a lot of what I said is extracted in the report that you can find online in the link below. That will be, I suppose, sent to you. At the moment, the French guide has not been translated into English, but it's really a matter of days. So be patient if you're not French speaker. Translation will be available soon, and the same for the English version of the UK report that will be translated into French very soon. We've been writing another report together with James and the Tiger project partners around the methodology for site selection, which is also focused on tidal energy, and that can be extrapolated for other type of ocean energy, such as wave energy. So I encourage you to have a look, and of course we'll be at your disposal for any question. Thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Marlene, and especially for the resources over there. Maybe you could put the link in the chat so that people can go and check them out.
Sure.
That would be helpful. Great. And we still have a few minutes for questions. So if you do have any questions about the presentations, don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A box. Or also, now that we've heard about the processes in the UK and in France, and you do have, if you have experience in other countries, I can see at least maybe developers active in Italy or Portugal. If you've had any different experience, or if the permitting process in those countries is very different from what we heard today, that would be interesting to hear. Or if you've encountered some different challenges to what were highlighted today, it would be really good to hear about those as well. But I'll start with a few questions while you're typing your own questions in the Q&A box. I know both of you are really focused on tidal, but I was just wondering if you know whether the same process applies to wave projects as well, projects as well.
Yeah, most of what I outlined today would apply to wave projects in the UK as well. So often they call them offshore generating stations, or so yeah, they often group them together. So yeah, a lot of a lot of the assessment processes as well, the methodologies, a lot of them will also work for wave devices too. And there have been a number of wave devices, more so at the kind of the test scale, but there have been, I think, 1 or 2 large or kind of 10 megawatt projects that have went through the planning process for wave devices in the UK as well.
And in France?
I suppose yes, it would be the same, because in the legislation that we discussed just before in the presentation, there is no specific mention for wave. So probably it would follow the first route that I discussed, and later on with tender maybe for wave, we would go for the second route.
Okay, thank you. All right, I see some questions coming in. The first one is for James. What is the difference between the marine license and the lease that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think the best way to consider it is the section 36 consent tends to cover the generating station, the cabling between the tidal turbines. The marine license also covers the export cable route from the generating station to the shoreline. So really the marine license is about kind of everything you're going to deposit on the seabed, and the section 36 consent focuses more on the generating station itself.
Yes, I'm muting myself. Thank you. Another question for James, but I will ask this actually to both of you. What do you see as the key barriers to consenting a project? Well, in Scotland, James, and in France, and how do you think the existing process could be improved?
Yeah, I think the key barrier for us is, as I kind of said, really, it's understanding the kind of the collision risk. We're asking, developers to consent very large projects, but we only have, limited number of years of good quality environmental monitoring data. So we need to validate this model. So when we see new pilot projects, they need to have good quality environmental monitoring hardware installed to provide that input into regulators. I guess the wider context as well, unfortunately, is that a lot of, ironically, we're trying to address climate change, but a lot of species are suffering already because of climate change, and their populations are, some of them are at risk, and have other factors that are impacting them. So that's the wider context. And while we're trying to address climate change, regulators are in a difficult position that they need to ensure that there's all the appropriate safeguards and they are precautionary. So we need to provide them with the evidence, and hopefully there will be maybe funding available to support ambitious and rigorous environmental monitoring to do that, particularly around collision risk issues.
Thank you. And Marlene, the same question to you.
Yeah, I suppose in France, the main barrier would be the lack of experience that we have, and the fact that consenting authorities have not yet consented a lot of projects, so many questions may delay unnecessarily the projects, and also the fact there is no official guidance maybe leads gives in the consenting authorities a lot of freedom to run the consent. So hopefully, and most of the time we have very innovative people willing to to cope with uncertainties and interpretation into the legislation. So thanks to them, we can consent the projects quite easily, but it can happen that it's not the case. And so it can lead to extra delay. And regarding the second question, we really look forward exploring the consenting routes for commercial tender. And this has been already be modified for offshore wind and very much improved. And today, I think the operator in offshore wind are very, or at least much more happy than previously with previous process. So hopefully it's a good way to go.
Great, thank you. I have one question myself. I think both of you mentioned that the decision or the lead time, the aspiration is 9 months or a few months, but in reality, it is often longer because the regulators request more information. I was wondering, how could this be solved? Like, how could we be in a situation where, you know, you submit your application and you know that that's it, it's like that this is what you need to do? Is it that developers are not, you know, submitting all the information that is required, or is there a lack of clarity of what information actually is required, or like what is the bottleneck there?
Yeah, that's a difficult one, I guess. I guess we've got constraints on us, you know, budgetary constraints, I guess, that we can't, you know, survey absolutely everything, and we need to have a proportionate approach to surveys, consenting, and everything else. But I think generally, yeah, good communication, regular meetings through the process. And I think I think Marine Scotland are updating their guidance again at the moment, just to kind of give developers expectations about how regularly they can expect meetings, and, you know, keeping in touch days, just to ensure that, as you say, when the information is all submitted, that it's, you know, it's ready to go. I guess, you know, the other thing will be resourcing, not at the regulatory level, and then even within government, just to, not just for us, but for offshore wind as well, kind of recognizing we're in a climate emergency. Long term, it would be fantastic if we could move to a situation where, and this is kind of probably, I'm sure, something that the more the offshore wind sector are looking at, where we don't necessarily have to collect 2 years of survey data. I can see you know, there's a different approach in France already that Marlene cited, where the government is, you know, is more responsible for gathering the baseline data and then handing that over to developers. It's less so the case in the UK, where developers are required to secure the lease and then start collecting the data. That just ultimately just takes time. So if we could move to a situation where, you know, all the survey data collected to date, you know, really and recognizing the fact we're in a climate emergency, maybe allowed projects to be consented without, you know, 2 years of survey requirements, that would be a very helpful place to get to in the context of the climate emergency that we're in.
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add to that comprehensive response. Maybe just that we've seen a big difference with offshore wind once our French government has really taken into consideration that energy and its absolute need for meeting the energy target in the short term. So this has changed a lot with many activity around offshore wind. Many simplification, many inclusion in the planning documents that are very helpful then locally for stakeholders to take decision. So a big big position from the national is very important, and we just hope they will have the same type of position for tidal quite soon.
Thank you for that. I see that our time is up now, so I will leave my my other questions for another time. But thank you very much, James and Marlene, for the presentations, and thank you to all the attendees. And I mean, I found this really helpful. I would like to know if attendees really would like to see this kind of webinars for other countries as well, Portugal, Ireland, or other countries where you're developing your projects. So we could organize another webinar looking at permitting processes there. So drop me an email if you have opinions on that. And just final thing, this webinar, of course, was recorded, so you can find it on the Egypt Ocean website, and the presentation slides will be uploaded there as well if you want to take a look. With that, thank you again, and I wish you a very nice afternoon. See you next time. Bye.